Alrighty, we'll get started. So this is the last content lecture for the course. So the material today will be on the exam. And then next week is a review lecture where there won't be any slides put up on Blackboard. We'll just come along and we will talk about the key themes from each of the topics that we've done, and it will be an open Q&A session for you to ask any queries that you have about the different topics that we've done, and things like that. So if you're planning on coming along, I'd suggest come along with your slides printed out and your handouts and so on, so you can follow along with your printouts while we're talking about the different topics as we go through. Today we're doing professional duties and ethical challenges. If you think way back to the beginning of the course, some of the learning outcomes that were listed for the course included teaching you about your professional obligations and also about the ethical challenges and conflicts that can arise in terms of professional practice. Why do we do that in this course? Well, they realised that there's nowhere else in these degrees where you actually get to think about the challenges and the ethical conflicts that you'll be exposed to in professional practice. And so this seemed an appropriate place to talk about the legal obligations and to really think critically about how you would deal with those ethical challenges when you come across them, and I assure you that you will. This is actually quite a difficult lecture for me to give, because pretty much for every example that I've got, I can list on one hand the number of times I've personally had to deal with that sort of conflict or been around someone who's done something questionable and things like that. So it's quite relevant and definitely not just your sort of theoretical area. You would have all hopefully got your marks back for the group assignments. Make sure that you pass the emails on to anyone in your group whose email address was incorrect when you sent me your submission email saying, yep, we've submitted. So if you know that you had incorrect email addresses there, make sure you forward it on to your other group members so everyone gets the feedback. As you can see, everyone generally did quite well in the assignment, and you could really see the learning that had happened across the semester from when you first started looking at planning schemes in week 1 compared to what was submitted as your mid-semester assessment. So you can pat yourselves on the back for a job well done there. We've got a few case studies that we'll go through today. And one of the ones is something that just was in the news a few days ago. And again, it really raises that question of what would you do? This is an example of a man who hired people over the internet to go and sell solar panels at a heavily reduced rate. So he held himself out as being Tony Smith. He hired people who had experience in selling solar panels. He had a registered office in a building. It was registered with the ATO. And it was for a heavily discounted price, a good $10,000 reduction. And these staff members queried with him, well, how come we're getting such a good deal on these prices? And he says, oh, it's because we're not an authorised reseller, so we're not tied into those market prices. And he used the reputations of these individuals who then went out and sold vast, vast numbers of solar panels that didn't exist, and for a man that didn't exist. And it turned out when they looked into it that the registered address that he had put down was for like level 29 in a building that only went up to 24 floors, and no one at the ATO had picked up on this fact. And it wasn't his real name. He had taken the identity of someone who he had interviewed for a job. So he'd said to them, well, in order to give you the job offer, you need to scan your passport to me, which actually is very, very common. And the guy had scanned his passport to him, and he'd used that then to forge his identity. So he managed to extract about $500,000 out of his account. He then brought in the liquidators in the hope that it would free up the other $500,000 in the account, and that's when the administrators' alarm bells started going. They were like, hang on a minute, and they reported it. But it really put those resellers, those individuals that have gone out, in a very difficult situation, because their instincts were telling them something wasn't quite right, but their boss was telling them, well, this is all legit, and you just keep telling everyone that this is the deal. And of course now what we have is many people who had been saving up for solar panels not being able to afford to put them on the roof of their houses and things like that, because their money has been taken. So that's just one example of what we see very commonly, and it's really important that you do ask yourself, what would I do? What would I have done? Because when you're in the moment and it happens, you don't have long to make a decision. You can't say, well, excuse me, while I go and consider this for, the next 3 or 4 days. You're in the middle of a workplace, you're in the middle of a professional setting where you're being asked to do something, and you're being asked to do it now. And so you almost need to go in prepared to say, well, where do I draw the line? At what point do I make a decision that I won't do that, or that's not right in my perspective? And at what point do you say, well, yeah, that's okay, I can live with that? In this case, the woman that they interviewed, she then had to go back and personally contact every single person that she had sold solar panels to and apologise that it was a scam and there were no panels and the money was not going to be recovered, and sort of, just went cap in hand to say, look, I'm sorry that I held this out as being a really good deal. So I felt quite sorry for her, because she obviously just didn't feel strong enough to push it further and ask more questions. So our first case study today is a very unusual one. This is the Alec Finlayson case, where he sued Armidale City Council. Now, you can almost count on one hand the number of times people have successfully sued the council. Okay? It does not happen very often at all. They've got a lot of legal protections around them in terms of protecting them from negligence actions for the decisions that they make. But there are cases where they can be held to be negligent in the way that they carry out their powers. And this is one of those examples where they were held to have breached their duty of care. So we owe a duty of care, and if we breach it, then we're negligent. And so Alec Finlayson was suing the council for negligence and for misleading and deceptive conduct. There was also the issue of breach of contract. So for those that don't know, this is Armidale in New South Wales. And our red circle there, that's the Martin Street site in Armidale. That's sitting close up. What you hopefully can see from that image, you can see it's developed. So you can see there's a number of houses on that site. And that's it up close. There you go. There's your development. You can see it's quite highly developed. And what this is showing you is the development that took place on land that was contaminated. So this gives you an idea of the timber treatment stacks that were on the site. So this was a timber treatment plant. For those big telephone poles and things like that, they put them into large cylinders and seep them in this chemical to treat the timber. And this happened over a period of time, and the site became contaminated. This is the aerial photograph for about 1976. So the site closed down about 1979, 1980, round about then. So they left the site and they moved elsewhere. And then the property was purchased in about 1982, and the council approved it for redevelopment. Okay, so we're talking about quite a close amount of time between a potentially contaminating activity on the site and it being approved for redevelopment. And in addition to that, the council was actually very aware of contamination on the site. So if you look in the very back of this picture, you can see a long cylinder that's going off the photo. It's a 75-foot cylinder, and this is what caused most of the problems. These are their storage tanks on the site, and this is the news article from 1968. They had 3 New South Wales ministers present at the opening of the plant, and it was, what's it say, a $300,000 timber treatment plant at Armidale, and that's their cylinder that they were so proud of. That was it being installed. And this is an advertisement in June. You can see talking about all the things that the plant will do, and of course talking about it in a very positive way. What we also know is that the site was very poorly managed. So this is 1976, okay? So again, just a few years before the council approved it to be redeveloped for residential use. We see that thousands of gallons of poison were released into the creek after someone broke into the site and released the liquid from that massive tank that we were talking about, this one here. And this was only one of many pollution incidents that had occurred on the site and which were reported to the council and were recorded in the council's own records. So you can see there's a very close link there between what was happening on the site and the knowledge of the council in terms of what was happening on the site. This is that creek being pumped dry of the contaminants that had escaped from the timber treatment works, and that creek then flows down into a bigger creek that goes through Armidale. This is what the site looked like in 1995. So this was when things started going to court and the court action was brought. And what had happened was, what you can see is there was no obvious reason for the purchaser to be concerned about contamination on the site. Okay, so when the first purchaser purchased it, they then did a stage 1 subdivision and then sold it on to Alex Finlayson. And Alex Finlayson, who was a developer, was going to develop the second stage of the site. And he had no knowledge of the history of the site. The company that sold it to him did not notify him of potential contamination on the site. And the council, when he went to them for approval for stage 2 of his residential development, did not notify him of contamination on the site. In fact, they approved it without any conditions relating to investigations of the soil or any sort of remediation. And the thing is that had he known about it while the site was vacant, so before he'd moved ahead with his development, then it would have been relatively easy for him to remediate the site. But once the houses were built on it, and as you saw from the photos, it was quite heavily developed, it aggravated all of the issues on the site. The contaminated materials had been churned over, and it was no longer just sitting in the top gravelly levels. All sorts of implications, including the fact that we now had residential uses in direct contact with contaminated soil. So we had vegetable gardens, children in the area, and so on and so forth. So what he did was he sued the council, and he sued the company that had sold the contaminated land to him. He was unsuccessful in his action against the company because they had gone into liquidation. Because, of course, normally you would go after the company that had profited from selling you the land. So he couldn't do that because they'd gone into liquidation. So he continued his action against the council. And he was successful. And the court said that, where are we? He said, given that the history of the site was known to the council had been negligent in approving a residential development of the land without requiring proof that the land was in fact suitable for subdivision for residential use. And he went on to say, I'm satisfied that the risk of persisting chemical contamination was not taken into consideration at any stage of the determination of any of the development applications. If it had been, some action would certainly have followed given the known history of the site. And so the court went on to find that the council had breached its duty of care, so it had been negligent, and they required that the council pay $1.5 million in damages plus interest to Alec Finlinson. So when we talk about those contaminated lands and old industrial sites and how, you know, it's okay for the council to make inquiries and investigate the environmental matters, this is a really good example of what happens if the council doesn't do that. They don't ask the right questions and require the right documentation. So just remember, you've got two handouts for today's lecture. You've got the one on professional duties and you've got the one on expert evidence. So make sure you've printed both of those out and that you're familiar with them. And what you're going to see is screenshots up on the slides, and they're extracts from these handouts. So we'll talk about breach of contract first, because that's the one that's most common to all professions, is you have to comply with the terms of your contract, which read another way means it's really important that you draft your contract to reflect what you're planning to do for your client. Okay? And so when we talk about the scope of work that you're going to do for your client, when you talk about the fees that you're going to charge, and when you talk about the level of expertise of the people who will work on the project, things like that, all of that, if that's not complied with, then you're going to have a breach of contract. Okay, so you're under a duty to make sure you comply with the terms of the contract that apply to the work you're doing with your client. For the purpose of the exam, make sure that you understand that you have to comply with contractual terms. Professional negligence is another very significant area, and this is the idea that you must take reasonable care. Okay, so again, it's not a standard of perfection. People do make errors, but you have to take reasonable care in providing advice, reasonable care in providing services to your clients. So if you're providing professional advice, then you have to take reasonable care to make sure your advice is correct. And you know, for example, if you give advice and you miss one of the overlays in the planning scheme, or you miss something to do with building heights or things like that, and you write to your client and you say, yes, this complies with the planning scheme, well, that would be negligent. That would be a duty to take reasonable care, because it's something that you're being paid to do as part of your services, is to accurately read the planning scheme and tell them what the legal position is. So you can be personally liable for negligence, and the company that you work for can be personally liable for your negligence as well. So what's reasonable will change, so there's no fixed and set idea of, you know, what is a reasonable level of care. It always depends on, they say it's a matter of fact and degree, so it just depends on the circumstances of each case. But certainly you always need to watch out if it's something that is sensitive to your client. So if it involves large sums of money, well, then you're required to exercise a higher level of care. If it's something that's very complex, then you are required to exercise a higher level of care, and so on. You know, things like if you advised your client that they did not need to refer to the minister under the EPBC Act, well, that would be something that would be considered negligent if you'd failed to carry out any investigations of whether any matters of national environmental significance were triggered by the project. So this is an email sent to Chris McGrath back in 2013 from someone who came through his 3103 course, who was a town planning graduate. And Catherine Andrews here says, the duty of care and professional indemnity topics are very relevant to the reality of a private consultancy or working in government, so that's great that it's included in the teaching syllabus. It's always a little daunting preparing written advice to a client, especially when it guides a potential purchase. To be exceptionally careful about what I put into writing was emphasised from the very beginning, as well as ensuring detailed notes were recorded on file after a phone conversation where advice was given in order to protect both the company financially and in terms of reputation. At the moment, it is vital we keep records of the relevant sections of the draft city plan when advising clients, because they're subject to change once the public advertising is finished. Professional indemnity, it's also why council is often reluctant to put anything in writing. I think that's probably very true. So you often find that council doesn't want to give written undertakings that something is or isn't lawful, because then they might be sued for negligence or for breach of their duty of care. So you can see what this email is showing us is that these things are going to continue to be very much front and centre of your lives as you go forward in your professional careers. And certainly I remember the first time I wrote a written advice to a client, and it is that absolute fear of, well, what if I got that wrong? But after a while you just realise to make sure you've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, and you just have to learn to be very methodical and systematic in how you go about reviewing work before you send it out. Misleading and deceptive conduct is something that we see a lot of in the legal area. So this is Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act. So this allows consumers to seek damages for misleading and deceptive conduct. It all got moved across to what they now call the Australian Consumer Law, so Section 18, but it's the same wording as we had in our good old Section 52. And trade or commerce, so it says a person must not, in trade or commerce, engage in conduct that is misleading or deceptive, or is likely to mislead or deceive. And that definition there for trade or commerce, that would include the work that you would do in return for payment as a consultant. So the fees that you're paid would mean that you would fall into that trade or commerce definition. The interesting thing here is it doesn't have to be intentional, so you don't have to set out to mislead or deceive anyone. It can be unintentional, but obviously when it's willful, you're going to see much stronger penalties being imposed. Damages is the most likely outcome, and they can be quite substantial when we talk about misleading and deceptive conduct, but also it can be used to set aside a contract. So to vary a contract, or we call it setting aside a contract, so it's as though it no longer exists. So for those of you that came to the Coal Seam Gas Practice Week, you would see that something like that would have been quite useful, but you have to prove that it's misleading or deceptive, or is likely to mislead or deceive. So our second case study, this is Wollongong City Council, and this is all about conflicts of interest and corruption. And conflicts of interest is a really quite a difficult area. It is such a thin line to walk between doing what your moral compass says is right and doing what other people tell you you should be doing. And this one's just really out there. It's quite an obvious case of conflict, but there's much more subtle ones, and in many ways they're the more difficult ones when you're dealing with it personally. So Wollongong, if you don't know, it's in New South Wales, so there's Wollongong down the bottom here. Wollongong City Council, a vibrant city nestled between seaside mountains and the Pacific Ocean, with a population approaching 200,000. Sounds delightful. What happened was there was an independent commission against corruption, so an ICAC inquiry into the Wollongong City Council, and there was a person who was in Wollongong City Council. She was assessing development applications, and while those development applications were being processed and assessed by her, she was sleeping with the various people that were submitting their applications. And as a result, she was referred to the Independent Commission Against Corruption for conflict of interest. Conflict of interest and corruption. And this is the report that was handed down. That was in 2008. And it said, as a result of its investigation, the Commission found that Ms. Morgan actively pursued close personal relationships in order to ingratiate herself with them and to try to secure them as future clients for a proposed consulting business that she wanted to establish. During the periods of these relationships, she was responsible for assessing and determining a number of development applications lodged with the Council on behalf of companies owned or controlled by them, and she assessed or determined each one in a way that was favourable to their interests. Okay. So there's two parts to the conflict of interest. So having a conflict of interest by itself is not unlawful. Okay, so having a development application come in from someone who you are sleeping with is not by itself unlawful. The unlawful part was the fact that she, A, didn't tell any of her supervisors that that was the case and allow them the opportunity to take the application off her, and B, decided the applications in a way that was then more favourable to the interests of the individuals who she was trying to key up as potential clients for her new business. So remember, she was acting for the council, so her duty was to act in the best interests of the council, and then the conflict of interest was the fact that she had this other plan in mind, which was to start lining up potential clients for her new business that she was going to open. So it says that Victoria Square and Quattro were two of the largest developments examined by the Commission. She was responsible for assessing and approving both development applications. There was unchallenged expert evidence which was accepted by the Commission that the decisions to grant approval were unlawful. The evidence established that the requirements of the Council's informal planning conferences policy were not followed, that the applications under the State Environmental Planning Policy No. 1 to vary the maximum floor space ratios were not well founded, and any reasonable person having regard to the relevant criteria for assessment would have determined that they were not well founded. And there was no justification on planning grounds to grant concurrence to the height of the developments under the Illawarra Regional Environmental Plan, and no reasonable person having regard to relevant matters would have concluded that there was such justification. Okay, so what do we need to know about duties to disclose and conflicts of interest? So again, this is in your handout. So a conflict of interest is generally of most relevance for elected representatives and government employees who are required to make decisions on matters that they may have a personal interest in. A conflict of interest involves a conflict between a person's personal interests and their duty as an elected representative, employee, or office bearer, or their duty to a client. The conflict may arise from a range of factors, including personal relationships. For example, if the applicant is the brother of the person assessing an application, other employment or clients, membership of special interest groups, or ownership of property involved in an application. Having a conflict of interest is not unusual, and it's not a wrongdoing in itself. However, failing to disclose and manage the conflict appropriately is likely to be a wrongdoing. Okay, so generally speaking, the duty of elected representatives and government employees is they must disclose any conflict of interest, and generally speaking, they shouldn't then go on to participate in any decision-making concerning matters in which they have a conflict of interest. Okay, so that's when we talk about public duties. In private practice, a conflict of interest should typically be disclosed to your employer or your client, and then you allow them to resolve it as they deem fit. Okay, so for example, if you're being asked to put together a proposal and you hold very strong objections to the proposal that you're being asked to put together, or you have a really close personal link to it. So, for example, in the handout it says if you're the neighbour to the proposed development, then obviously that's a conflict of interest. And the first person you should be going to is your employer, and obviously the client needs to know, and then they can make a decision. And sometimes they'll come back and they'll say, okay, thanks for letting me know, thanks for being honest. You know, do you think it's going to interfere with your ability to work on this project? And if you say, no, it's fine, but I wanted you to know, then they'll often say, okay, that's fine, you can continue to work on it. But equally, if you really feel that you can't put aside whatever that conflict is, then the best case is to withdraw from working on the matter, or withdraw from making a decision in relation to the matter. But that's something that is on your shoulders. You're the one who knows whether or not you have a conflict of interest, and you're the one who needs to speak up and be open about it before it becomes an issue. It's always much worse if it's the client or the employer that finds out first that there was a potential conflict and that you hid it, because then it makes it look like there was something that you were hiding. So yeah, always much better to be upfront with these things. It won't surprise you to know we have duties not to engage in official corruption or bribery. So they're criminal offences for official corruption and bribery of public officials. So that's set out in the Criminal Code, Section 87. And there's an actual clause in there for corruption and bribery. So if a person who is employed in the public service or holds a public office, okay, so that would include people in city councils who are considering development applications, they would be someone who is in public office, being charged with the performance of any duty by virtue of their employment. If they corruptly ask for, receive, obtain, or agree or attempt to receive or obtain any property or benefit of any kind for themselves or any other person on account of anything done or omitted to be done, they are guilty of a crime and liable to imprisonment for 7 years and to be fined at the discretion of the court. And then there's a separate offence for someone who corruptly gives, confers, procures or promises or offers to give any persons employed in the public service any property or benefit of any kind on account of an act or omission on the part of the person employed or holding an office. Okay, so it works both ways. Both the person who receives the benefit can be held liable for corruption, but also the person who gives it to them, the person who procures it, the person who promises or offers it, the person who confers it. So, for example, if you are asked to go and talk to the City Council about getting a better outcome for your development application in return for some sort of benefit, it doesn't have to be financial. It could be the offer to help their nephew, go to college. It can be an offer of future employment, whatever it may be. The fact that your client has asked you to go and be the one that makes that offer, that then means that you would be liable for corruption. Even though you're not the one who's then actually handing over whatever that financial benefit or other benefit is, the fact that you have promised it or procured it for them would be enough for you to be caught up in the corruption allegations. So as a public servant, including as a local government employee, it's a crime for you to corruptly ask for or receive money, property or any other benefit for the performance of your duties. And then as a consultant, it's a crime for you to corruptly offer or give money, property or any other benefit to an elected official or public servant, or to be a party in that act. So aiding someone else to do it would be enough to pull you under Section 87 of the Criminal Code. So, bribery is a real it's a real challenge in all countries across the world, and Baker McKenzie wrote this report in 2011 talking about this idea of, do Australian companies take bribery seriously? You know, what's their awareness of the issues of bribery? This is a quote from it. They said, Australian companies operating globally must be confident their compliance programs are sufficiently strong to discourage misconduct. There's a growing expectation among regulators that multinational companies have adopted robust anti-corruption compliance systems. So you can see there's a need for that resilience to be there in our big multinational companies, for them to understand that, you know, corruption's not acceptable, for them to be able to resist any corruption where it exists, particularly in overseas countries, where perhaps it's slightly more open in terms of saying, well, look, we can help you here, but what can you do for us in return? And the Baker McKenzie report is just pointing out that what we need is a strong internal structure to these companies so that they're able to withstand those requests from corrupt officials. This is the perceptions of global corruption. So this was a survey of multinational corporations, and it was multinational local companies across a wide number of jurisdictions, and it's asking them to talk about their perceptions of corruption. So the darker the colour up on that screen, the higher the perceived risk of corruption in that country. And you can see it's probably not surprising the ones that are the darker colours there in terms of perceived corruption. So this one is the one we've been talking about a few times across the semester. This is all about the coal seam gas approvals in Queensland. And this is when Simone Marsh spoke to Four Corners about what was happening with the approvals for coal seam gas in Queensland. And it touches on a few of the duties that we're talking about today, so the duty of confidentiality, and also what happens when you have a conflict between your professional duty, for example, your duty to act in the best interest of the client, or your duty of confidentiality, and then what your own personal ethical viewpoint is. So in this case, Simone Marsh was a whistleblower, so she breached her duty of confidentiality to speak out publicly to protect the community. But you have to remember that she had to cross a line in order to do that. And the line that she crossed was she was in breach of the duty of confidentiality to her client. So I'll play you some of this.
Alive with methane.
Never seen it before.
Water you can set fire to. The industry says it's all perfectly safe.
The last thing I want to be associated with is an industry that's going to be toxic or poison. It's just not that.
But others disagree.
I think the truth is that it's not an ecologically sustainable activity.
Behind the scenes in the great coal seam gas debate. Welcome to Four Corners. The CSG industry is worth many billions and growing massively, particularly down the eastern half of Australia. For cash-strapped, revenue-hungry governments, it's a welcome bonanza. But the politics are tricky. There's the promise of jobs in declining rural centres and big export dollars. But many farmers and environmentalists, not always natural allies, are not only concerned but deeply angry. The biggest concern is focused on the impact of mining on water tables and water quality, and how that in turn will affect prime agricultural land and town water. Under pressure, the New South Wales government has banned CSG activity within 2 kilometres of cities and country towns, and the federal government now plans to assess future CSG projects for their impact on water. The industry...
Okay, I'll just click you forward to Simone.
All of this raises some basic but fundamental questions about whether proper baseline studies have been done on the water table and environmental impacts. Which leads to another important question. Why has the coal seam gas industry been allowed to proceed at such a rapid pace? Tonight, Four Corners can reveal why. Simone Marsh played a critical role in the approval process of Australia's largest coal seam gas developments, Santos's $18 billion project and QGC's $20 billion project in southern Queensland. She was a key insider and she's telling her story for the first time.
I think the truth is that it's not an ecologically sustainable activity. Obviously they didn't want to say that. They wanted approval to come in and conduct that activity. They didn't want anyone to understand what the long-term impacts were going to be and the long-term costs associated with this activity.
Four Corners asked Santos and QGC for an on-camera interview, but they declined. Rick Wilkinson is the industry spokesperson.
I think it's right and proper that there should be whistleblowers, and if something's not right, then they should raise it. But I'm confident from what I've seen that the right processes were followed, and there were many checks and balances on the way through.
Simone Marsh's job for the first half of 2010 in the Queensland Department of Infrastructure and Planning was to assess the environmental impact of these massive billion-dollar Santos and QGC developments. They were deemed state-significant projects to be overseen by Queensland's Coordinator General.
It was an impossible task. Firstly, the information wasn't there, so you can't do an assessment without the basic site information, the baseline studies, and an understanding of where the infrastructure was going to be laid out and which environmentally sensitive areas were going to be impacted.
This is a remarkable claim, but it's backed up by 900 pages of documents obtained by Four Corners through the Right to Information legislation in Queensland. The documents detail an approval process that was rushed, made with insufficient information and put commercial considerations above environmental ones. Simone Marsh's first task was to assess the Santos project. She was surprised to find only a concept with little hard data on where the wells or pipelines were going or potential environmental impacts.
It was quite frightening that they would consider approving such a project without the basic information that a normal mining project would have been asked to submit, given that this was like 600 times the size of a standard large mine. And for a large mine, you would normally have the boundaries clearly articulated. You would have done all the baseline studies beforehand.
In particular, Simone was shocked that no assessment was going to be done on the impacts to groundwater for the Santos project.
I was taken into a meeting room, sat down and told that there wasn't going to be a chapter on groundwater. And I was stunned. I said, "What are you talking about? What do you mean there's not going to be a chapter on groundwater? It's one of the biggest issues for the project." And he just repeated the words that there was not going to be a groundwater chapter in the Santos Coordinator General's report, and wouldn't give me any reason why or why not.
But a document from the 4th of May 2010 offers some explanation. It's a brief sent by the Department of Planning and Infrastructure to the Coordinator General. It states, "As advised previously, not all the usual information is available." And goes on, "This has been difficult and uncertain without the full suite of information normally available." we are mindful of the Coordinator General's report being able to provide a bankable outcome.
They're after a bankable outcome, which is not anything to do with an environmental impact assessment process. They basically just want an approval. That's all they want, is an approval with some conditions that the companies can live with.
When Simone Marsh learnt the timeframes for the Santos assessments were going to be cut short, she decided to act and wrote this email to her superiors listing 26 concerns.
I wrote that email to make sure that the Deputies Coordinator Generals, the Assistant Coordinator Generals and the Project Directors were aware that the information I had been preparing and that I had been drafting and sending through to the Project Directors was not making it into the final report, and that key information that and conclusions that I had drawn from the material that I could access was being altered or ignored, and that the proponents themselves were having a large role in dictating the information that went into the report and into the conditions as well.
3 days before the Santos report was due, Simone made one last attempt with this document to warn about the potential damage to the water table. The next day, there was this response. I have significant concerns with the words proposed by Simone. On the 28th of May, the Coordinator General at the time, Colin Jensen, delivered his report on the Santos project. There was no groundwater assessment, only half a page dealing with policy and legislation. But surprisingly, the Coordinator General said he was not convinced there was sufficient detail to determine impacts on environmental values. After reviewing Santos's environmental impact statement and its supplementary, the Coordinator General called on Santos to provide 10 key reports, including comprehensive water management plans for the next phase of approval. Rick Wilkinson was head of the Santos LNG coal seam gas unit at the time. It says the reports were submitted.
Santos didn't provide fundamental data to make those assessments.
They did provide the fundamental data. I disagree with that statement very strongly.
So you're disagreeing with the Coordinator General, are you?
At that particular point, he can raise questions about what data, further data he needs. A supplemental addresses those particular issues, and then he has many options to condition the data so that if the data is not provided to his satisfaction, the EIS is not approved, you can't go on to the next step.
Okay, let's stop it there. The whole thing's a really good watch, but we'll stop it there. Okay, so the key issue for this, as fascinating and intriguing and also baffling as the full context is in terms of the fact that these projects were being pushed ahead, the interesting part about this is that dilemma that Simone Marsh went through here of, do I do what my superiors are telling me to do, or do I push back and voice my concerns, knowing what the consequences would be? Now, she's confident, she's experienced, she's been there long enough to know that if you push back, there are repercussions. And so it's in itself a really interesting case study in seeing when she decided to cross that line and sort of speak out. There was a lot of stuff in the media around the same time talking about criticising the approval processes for coal seam gas, criticising the fact that these things were pushed through. The Courier Mail called it the dash for gas, this idea that we were pressuring bureaucrats to rush through the coal seam gas approvals, and we had full-page spreads where the bureaucrats were coming to the Courier Mail and saying that they had felt pressured to approve these projects without having sufficient time to consider the impacts of them on environmental matters. And this is an excerpt of it. Bureaucrats leaned on by Bligh heavies, it says. And it says, public servants at the two departments tasked with giving the official go-ahead to Queensland's new coal seam gas industry were blindsided by Bligh government demands that two of the gigantic projects be approved within weeks of each other. And it says, public servants were hit with the demands from the government to tackle the $18 billion Santos project at the same time as the $16 billion QGC project, with them both being approved in November of the same year. And just days before the approval was granted, public servants are warning the directors of the government's assessment team that they still had not been given any detailed information on pipelines and the location of wells, and they warned a long list of environmental issues had not been fully analysed. And it said that, and then it goes on to say that the government has said that they had no concerns about the environmental impacts of the industry. So this is a response to a request for draft conditions to be submitted within 3 days. It says, I've consistently been advised by the Department of Infrastructure and Planning that QGC was down the track and that DIP had not even started writing their report. We've had no warning for the sudden request for immediate provision of QGC conditions or any notice of a meeting tomorrow. In addition, we have the APLNG comment on their EIS due today, for which we were given less than 4 weeks to deal with 10,000 pages. Once again, I am faced with a physically impossible request along with the other 80 EIS projects that are starting to slip. And this was revealed to the Courier Mail, so that this is part of that article. Now, that request to speed up the decision-making process, if you think back to when we talked about the State Development and Public Works Organisation Act, remember they can be classified as state significant or coordinated projects. There's abilities for the Coordinator General to make requests that projects be decided more speedily, so there's various instructions that he can give. That's why the State Development and Public Works Organisation Act was passed, to allow projects to be pushed through in a timely manner. The issue is not so much whether that part of it was lawful, because it's what it was doing to the environmental impact assessment process, because it was then preventing the environmental impact assessment process from meeting its own obligations under the legislation to properly analyse the environmental impacts. And this is where the concern was coming from, was we had an under-resourced department looking at a very novel area. We talked about this when we did the coal seam gas lectures, about how this was unprecedented, the scale of these projects were unprecedented. And so because of that, the combination of the two things meant that we were having decisions here that were questionable. Now, what is the duty of confidentiality? Okay, well, in addition to what we see as confidentiality clauses in contracts, the common law also imposes a duty of loyalty and fidelity upon all employees. This comes out of the contract of employment, but also if the employee is in a special position of trust and confidence. This means that an employee must not use information obtained in the course of his or her employment to the detriment of their employer. And who was Simone Marsh's employer? It was the Queensland government, okay? So that duty of confidentiality is they must not use information obtained in the course of his or her employment to the detriment of the employer. And of course, a similar thing would happen in terms of your contract with clients with disclosing confidential information. Yep. Sorry, I can't hear.
Was it unlawful that they didn't allow the DIS?
No, it wasn't unlawful, because a decision was made. So it wasn't that it was unlawful, it's that it wasn't in accordance with the purposes of the Act. So those decisions weren't set aside. So the project still went ahead, but what she was trying to do was raise public awareness of what had happened behind the scenes. Because we know those projects went ahead in the end, so they weren't able to be challenged and set aside. Remember also under the State Development Public Works Act, there are much more limited abilities to review decisions made under the Act, so there's a limit on the judicial review that can take place. That's another reason why these major projects try and get classification under the SDPOW Act. So that's another reason why it's useful to them. So the basic rule for confidentiality is you should not disclose documents or information obtained through the course of your employment that are not publicly available unless you're authorised by either your client or your employer. Okay, so for example, when you give information to the council as part of a development application, you've got your client's approval to pass on that commercial and confidence information. But if a third party, like an environmental group, started asking new information about what was going on the site, let's say it's a coal seam gas project and you had an environmental group coming and saying to you, hey, where's the groundwater study? You know, what do we know about potential impacts, or are they going to carry out more studies on the groundwater? You would be in breach of your duty of confidentiality if you spoke to that third party, that environmental group or whoever it may be, about what you know about the groundwater impacts if you do not have the consent of your client to do so. Or if you act for the government, you would need the consent of your employer before you started sharing that information around. So government employees, they have a duty not to disclose information that's not publicly available, that's obtained through the course of their employment. And so again, if they become aware of information because they're reviewing a development application, they can't then start disclosing that information to third parties. Otherwise, they're going to be in breach of that duty of confidentiality. We do have the Public Interest Disclosure Act. So the Public Interest Disclosure Act, what that does is where it's considered to be a real danger to the public, either because of health impacts or because of environmental impacts, and in theory you would be protected from being prosecuted by the Public Interest Disclosure Act. So it's like a whistleblower's protection. The difficulty is that you don't know until you try and use that as a defence whether or not you fall under it and whether or not you're going to be protected by it. And if it turns out that the thing you're talking about is not considered to be a substantial and specific danger to the community, then you've lost that protection and you'll be prosecuted. And it can be a criminal offence if you're a government employee, or it can be a civil offence, so it would be breach of contract, and it would be financial damages if you're working for a private company. The other thing it also doesn't do is it doesn't protect you from losing your job. It doesn't protect you from having your reputation slandered in terms of then not being able to go on and get employment elsewhere because you have spoken publicly about what you believe to be in the public interest, but obviously going up against the government with these things is quite an ambitious thing to do, and it's something that even for Simone Marsh it had real consequences for her. You know, she did what she felt was right at the time, but you know, certainly it made things very difficult. Yeah.
What are those consequences, please?
For
This chick, did she get prosecuted?
she didn't get prosecuted, but she got absolutely dragged through the mud. I mean, one of the reasons she did this interview was to try and defend her name that had been absolutely dragged through the mud for speaking out, and for as soon as you kind of, you know, go up against the institution closes ranks against you, and you feel the full force of that, and it's quite an intimidating thing to have to go through. So She knew that. She did know that that's what was ahead of her, but you always have to wonder what they would have done differently if they had a chance to go back and do it again. Because the difficulty with things like this is you think, well, if enough people know that wrongdoing is happening, then surely it will stop. You know, that's why we have these whistleblowers. That's why they get to that point and they say, no, I'm going to speak out. And I think the thing that I find the most frustrating is that it doesn't seem to change anything. You know, these coal seam gas approvals went ahead. These projects went ahead. It didn't stop those. And it doesn't change the institution, and it doesn't change what is happening to the individuals that are speaking out. So it was a very brave thing that she did and a very honourable thing that she did, but it came at great cost. So, yeah. So in theory, a public servant can make a public interest disclosure under that Public Interest Disclosure Act. In practice, speaking out publicly against your employer is unlikely to be good for your career. And that goes for everything, not just about things like this, but you know, as soon as you start acting against the best interests of your employer, you learn pretty quickly how nasty things can get. Chris McGrath has an example that he always sort of gives at this point, because he worked for an environmental regulator up north, and he was just frustrated at the fact that there were these environmental offences taking place and no enforcement action being taken. And he was under this duty not to disclose confidential information, so not to disclose the information that he'd obtained in the course of his employment. And so in the end, his loophole that he found was that he resigned. He waited until he had physically left the office, so he was no longer in his role as a employee, and so therefore was no longer falling within that restriction. And he took all the documentation that he had of all the examples of every environmental offence that wasn't being pursued by the department, put it in an envelope and posted it to his local minister, so that they received a copy of what was happening. And so, you know, that's just one of the things that he did in a way that he knew he was going to leave. He couldn't put up with, you know, this lack of, whatever, insert your chosen word there. But he needed to leave anyway because he couldn't be a party to it. And he wanted to make sure that someone else knew about it as he left. And so that was his way of just saying, well, I'll make a stand and I'll post this off. And yeah, we all have moments like that where we say, well, do I stay or do I go? And if I go, exactly how much do I tell them that I disagree with what they're doing here? And what will that do to my career if I do so? Yeah. You're talking about the Public Interest Disclosure Act? So you can't say anything. So you can't say anything, but if you do speak out, then you can argue that it was something that was substantially, so if it matters involved the commission of an offence involving a substantial and specific danger to the environment or to the community. Yeah, so you can see it's not something that you would easily say, oh yeah, this issue of sustainability is definitely falling under that protection. So they deliberately make it obscure, so you're not entirely sure if you've got the defence of it or not. She was not prosecuted. She wasn't prosecuted. So she spoke out about it because she felt it was a danger to the community. So that was her angle. But she wasn't prosecuted, but she was not sure either whether she was going to be prosecuted. So she had that hanging over her of, are they going to bring charges? Well, sort of. So she'd get prosecuted on a couple of things. So her contract with the agency, and then also the Public Interest Disclosure Act, yeah. So hearing a public servant speak out publicly against a government decision is very unusual and very courageous. Most public servants observe what we call a code of silence, or they try and quietly leak damaging documents anonymously to the press. And if you become a public servant, you'll be very aware of the politics surrounding that, and of the fact that, you know, you need to be careful about what you put in writing, you need to be careful about emails that you send. You'll have very senior people in your department making it clear to you what you're allowed to put in writing and what you're not allowed to put in writing. You know, things like they'll often say, go and look at these issues for this application. You know, it's a large application, it's worth X amount, so I've told the minister I will look at this personally. Go and look at these issues, come back and verbally report to me on what you think. So they make sure you don't put anything in writing that might say that you have concerns about the groundwater, or you have concerns about particular species impacts, if they don't want a document trail showing that those issues are there. And so then when you come back, because of course it's always the junior ones that get heavied in these cases, they'll say, oh, well, don't you look at those, don't worry about that, we've got that under control, someone more senior is going to deal with that. You just look at these other issues and draft that part of the report. And again, that's very common. Yeah. No, he didn't. He was lucky, to be honest. When I heard the story, I was like, oh, Chris. Because that was a really, really fine line. And again, he didn't know whether they were going to take action against him. He just had to do something. But equally, it didn't make any difference. Nothing changed. And that's the difficulty, is I have found over the years, it's the person who speaks out against the wrongdoing who is more badly hurt than the people who are doing the wrongdoing. And that's a real burden to take on your shoulders. So it says, if you work for government, politics will impact heavily on your career. So true. So if you're employed by the Queensland Government, you're assessing coal seam gas, coal mines, you won't be able to recommend that they refuse them because of things like Scope 3 emissions and climate change. You won't be able to refuse coal seam gas projects based on cumulative groundwater impacts. You know, these are things that aren't politically part of our current decision-making frameworks, and so, you know, you can't just plonk yourself in the middle of a political institution and say, well, I will change the way decisions are made, and I will make sure these things are taken into account as part of the decision-making process, because you'll just get shut down and kicked out the door. And what, you know, the important thing to remember when we talk about Simone Marsh, you know, she knew what was coming. She felt it was serious enough to speak out, and she was outraged enough to speak out, but she knew what she was losing by doing it. So she took that hit and she took that sacrifice in order to speak out. And I think that's why it's so important that we listen to that documentary and we listen to what she did, because even though it didn't really change things, at least we understand why the coal seam gas regulatory framework is where it is. It's like that out of a deliberate political influence that went into the decision-making process. So yeah. One of the other students, so this was a 7124 student, wrote to Chris about, you know, how he felt about this lecture, and one of the things he pointed out is the importance of looking after your mental well-being when you're going through these processes and you have that sense of dilemma and stress and conflict. He said, when dealing with ethical and professional responsibility issues, a key consideration is taking stock of your own mental state when deciding how to respond to these issues. From my experience, basically, if you're in a poor mental state, then you're in a much poorer position in terms of your ability to effectively respond. So you lose that resilience. So if you're already feeling, you know, like you're just on shaky ground, and as soon as you go into these difficult situations, it's going to amplify that. He says, being involved in resolving ethical issues can often take an onerous toll on people, as they are often political and highly complex to deal with. So the question for me is, do I have the capacity, do I have a good enough mental state to engage in a particular ethical issue? If I do not have the capacity, then I shouldn't engage in the problem. Alternatively, if the issue is that important to me that I need to come up with an appropriate strategy, but a strategy where I put myself in the middle of resolving the ethical issue isn't a good idea. And this is someone with more than 20 years professional experience. And what he's really saying is, you've got to make a decision. Are you ready for the backlash that will come from stepping in and speaking out? And if you're not resilient at that point in time, if you're already feeling stressed, if you're already feeling uncertain in yourself, putting yourself in the middle of that ethical issue and standing up and speaking out could be what breaks you. You know, you got to feel tough enough and strong enough to say, yeah, I can weather the storm that will come from being the one person in the room that's speaking out about this. Yeah, go on.
I think that, like, slightly a bit not true, because say if she speaks out, like, yes, she might get the backlash. You don't know if the community mobilisation as a result of the evidence.
No.
Saying that it has no result.
Only because I've been there, I have to shake my head and say, no. You'd be amazed at how much intimidation and bullying comes from big corporate structures when they feel threatened by someone speaking out. And it's relentless, absolutely relentless. And it can go on for months and years of backlash just because you spoke out about something that wasn't right at the time. So even if you have someone coming to you and saying, you're not nuts, you were right to speak out because that was blatantly wrong, it doesn't change the other 20, 30 people that are saying, how could you do that to this organisation? After, you know, where was your loyalty? Where was your fidelity? You know, we gave you your job, and so on and so forth. And, you know, it depends on how strong your mental structure is to say, stuff them, I did the right thing. But it's amazing how as the consequences creep in, you start saying, why did I speak out? You know, what did I gain and what was gained from speaking out? Now, in Simone Marsh's case, she got media profiling. She got her voice heard out there. And that doesn't often happen. That's why she's unusual in that not only did she speak out, but she spoke out and her voice got through. It got through all of the, you know, all the decoys that the government was trying to throw to make sure people didn't hear what she had to say. But I do think this email is important, and it's in here for a reason, because you know, people like Chris McGrath, who again put himself out there, you know, you do then go, okay, so what is the next wave of backlash going to be, and am I ready for it? So yeah. So other ethical and legal issues you need to know, and obviously you need to know this both for your own professional use, but also for the exam. So duty to avoid discrimination, duty to maintain a safe workplace, and duty to avoid sexual harassment. Three key things that we need to chat about. So discrimination. So there's a broad duty to avoid discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion or sex, and it includes employment in the workplace. Okay? We do have an exception to it, which is you can positively discriminate against groups that you want to provide equal opportunity to in the workplace. You know, like when we see job advertisements where they say Indigenous applicants, you know, are encouraged to apply or will be considered favourably, things like that. So that's an act of positive discrimination. But you can't have negative discrimination based on these things. And so that's race, ethnicity, religion, and also, you know, male, female. You'd be amazed at how often that's still happening today. I mean, we see examples in interview panels where they say, oh, well, we won't bring in so-and-so, well, because, you know, their religious beliefs, they'll be praying all day and they'll need to go to temple and this and that. And, you know, people have these biases and they have these perceptions that they bring with them to the table, particularly at interview panels. And that although there is a duty not to do it, it's amazing how much it still infiltrates through those processes, particularly interview processes, because they are such a subjective process anyway. This was, again, something from the media. This was 11th of May 2017. The Palaszczuk government apologised to members of the LGBTI community who were convicted of historical homosexuality activity in Queensland. They introduced legislation to expunge all of their historical convictions. And one of the reasons, I'm sure there's many reasons, but one of the reasons why those convictions caused so much damage to those people who were convicted is every time they went to apply for a job, every time they tried to apply for a visa overseas, they had to disclose that they had a criminal conviction, and of course the nature of the criminal conviction. So every time they needed to get a job, every time they needed to get a visa to go and travel in another country, anywhere that required them to disclose history of convictions, they had to say that they had a conviction of homosexuality activity. So that's been expunged now. So all of those previous convictions have been wiped, and that was announced just a couple of weeks ago. There's a duty to maintain a safe workplace, and that includes avoiding workplace harassment and bullying. This is all under the Workplace Health and Safety Act. So a person conducting a business or an undertaking must ensure, as far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of their workers while at work in the business or the undertaking. So that means providing and maintaining safe systems of work, the safe use, handling and storage and transport of plant and structures and substances, provision of information and training and instruction and supervision to protect them from risks to their health and safety. And workers have a reciprocal obligation to take reasonable care for their own health and safety, for the health and safety of others in the workplace, and to comply with health and safety instructions, policies and procedures. Harassment and bullying falls under the Workplace Health and Safety Act because it can cause workplace injuries, and if there's a behaviour in the workplace that's repeated, it's unwelcome, it's unsolicited, and it offends, intimidates, humiliates or threatens a person, then that would be considered workplace harassment, and action must be taken to stop the behaviour. So this might be, abusing a person loudly, ridicule, being put down, isolating them from the group, using sarcasm and so on. And there's an obligation there for supervisors to take action to do something about that bullying culture. So what they're trying to do is change this idea of, oh, well, it's just them, they're just mucking about, and actually try and understand that harassment has consequences, that harassment causes harm to people in the workplace and shouldn't be allowed to continue. Again, this has been in the news over the last week or so about the deaths at Eagle Farm. You might remember this was last year. There were 2 construction workers killed at the Eagle Farm Racecourse that was being constructed. What happened was there was a falling concrete block, which I think I've got on. Let me just check. I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, there it is. So what happened was these men were told to climb down into the pit, and the only way out was via a ladder, and then the crane was lifting the prefabricated concrete walls into place. And while they were down in the pit, they were sending text messages to their supervisor, letting him know that the prefabricated walls were not fitting into the sort of studs and things that were at the bottom to catch them. So someone had mismeasured it, and as it turns out, the guy who was in charge of the site hadn't brought in the necessary experts to make sure that it was designed in a way that it was going to fit. So corners had been cut, he hadn't brought in the necessary expertise, and then on top of that, these men had been forced to go down into an area where there wasn't a clear plan for what to do if something went wrong. So they shouldn't have been down in such a confined space with no way to escape. And what happened was one went into place, it started to slide. They climbed up the ladder and they managed to get away from the first falling block. And then as they slid back down it to get out of harm's way, the second one collapsed and crushed them, and they died instantly. Now, what they found was that wasn't a safe workplace. But of course, this is what one of the themes for today is, that idea of what would you have done. You know, they were trying to let their boss know that things weren't going to plan, that it wasn't fitting into place, and they were told to stay down there and that, you know, see what they could do. And they ended up losing their lives because of it. There's a new law that's coming into effect, and it's a law essentially related to, you know, creating dangerous conditions that lead to death, and it's specifically designed to address both this and the deaths at Dreamworld, which are both considered by the Queensland Government to be examples where employers created a situation that then led to unsafe work practices and then led to the deaths of people. So it's meant to target something like this, but also something where you have an environment like at Dreamworld where the ride itself was unsafe. So it'll be interesting. That the criticism is that upping the offence provisions and putting more penalty on in a situation like this would not have stopped these men from dying. It would not have stopped the situation from occurring. All it means is that the next person to do it will have a heavier fine put on them, or you know, prison term, whatever it may be. But that actually what we need is more laws changing the way that we go out and we audit sites. So increasing the level of audits and increasing the requirements on how these workplaces are managed, rather than having an offence provision that applies after it's all occurred. And so, yeah, this is just, this is April 2017, so this is the Palaszczuk government saying they're going to carry out an audit of work health and safety laws with an independent review and looking at ways to improve those work health and safety laws in response to the tragedies at Eagle Farm and Dreamworld last year. But you'll see it's very much trying to show that the government is on top of this and changing things, and you can see the offences, this idea of gross negligence causing death, increase in the penalties, and the penalty will be maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment and fines of up to $3 million for corporations, $600,000 for individual directors, and $300,000 for others. And then this is just another slide talking about this idea of negligence causing death that they've announced. There's also a duty to avoid sexual harassment. This is a prohibition under the Anti-Discrimination Act. And it's described as an unwelcome sexual advance, unwelcome request for sexual favours, or other unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature which makes a person feel offended, humiliated or intimidated, and where that reaction is reasonable in the circumstances. And it can include suggestive comments, insinuations, propositions, physical contact, and it's one of those areas where, again, there is something in the legislation that says, you know, that there is a protection from sexual harassment. It's an entirely different matter to go and accuse someone of sexual harassment, particularly in the workplace. And when I first started work at my big law firm in Sydney, one of the individuals in the firm was well known for, you know, sexually harassing all the young female grads. And so we were told by HR when they did the induction, you do not allow so-and-so to close the door when you have meetings with him. If you allow him to close the door when you have meetings with him, then you will just have to put up with the consequences, and there will be no there'll be no action taken by the firm. You'll be considered to have consented to whatever then happens. Now, he was one of the most senior members of the corporation, okay? So you then have this difference in power of someone who is incredibly senior and who has control over the future of your career at this firm, saying, I'm just going to close the door, and you're there going, no, we'll just leave that open. And, you know, that was so common. That was not considered unusual. That was very common. And we had a whole load of grads in a different area to mine, thank goodness, who were taken out on a cruise ship in the middle of Sydney Harbour, plied with alcohol, thrown overboard so that all their clothes got see-through, and then pulled back on board and leered at, and, you know, it was all very inappropriate. There was inappropriate touching, and they refused to take them back to shore so that they could get changed, and these poor girls arrived back absolutely in tears and very upset, and they made a complaint, and they were fired. All of them. The whole lot were told, well, if you can't put up with the culture that we have in our group, then you don't belong here. And the whole lot of them were told to just walk, and told that they could be very easily replaced with other graduates who were more than happy to go along with what was just a bit of fun, and it was a Christmas party, and la la la. And again, that was so normal. So what we find is that it happens very commonly, and you have to be very aware of it, because you don't want it to get to a point where you actually have to say something about it. So it's a similar sort of thing to the whistleblower of, you know, it's a difficult situation. And it happens everywhere. It happens in universities, it happens in the workplace. I mean, I've heard stories of other universities where, you know, if you went into so-and-so's office and you sat next to them on the couch or whatever, you'd get a grade increase. The university knew this. It was very prevalent, well aware of it. What did they do? They just took away his sofa. You know, they didn't do anything to him. He still worked there. These things happened. They just took the sofa away. And, you know, to me, that didn't really feel like they'd done enough. That wasn't what was the right thing to do. That wasn't what should have happened. But I think I'm getting quite old and jaded now, because I've realised that the right thing doesn't seem to happen, even if you speak out. And this was just a news article from February where they said, you know, why is it that men aren't able to make complaints about sexual harassment? You know, why is it that it's okay for them to be pranked and generally be ridiculed and put down and all these things? It's still sexual harassment, and they should still have a right to a workplace where they're not harassed. And so this was an example. They'd pranked a school cleaner. The staff members of the school pranked the cleaner to make it look like they'd had an orgy in the staff room. And he was really quite distressed by it all. He actually took an action against the school to the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal, because he had to quit his job. He was so distressed by the pranks that they were pulling on him. I won't spend too much time on these. You just need to be aware that wherever you go in your careers, you'll probably have a code of conduct that applies to what you do. I know I have one as a lawyer, so I'm governed by the Law Society of Queensland, and there are certain things I cannot do. One of them is, whenever I appear before the court, I must always act in the best interest of the court and not in the best interest of my client. So if I have a bias, I can be disbarred. It makes it easier to walk that line of saying, well, this is right and this is wrong, when you can say, well, I'm a lawyer and I'll get kicked out if I don't. But all of these organisations have these codes of conduct about taking reasonable care, avoiding negligence, avoiding conflicts of interest. It's well worth having a look through at what they have to say, you know, about this is all very close to what we've been talking about, you know, making sure that you avoid conflicts of interest and disclose it if it is an issue. This is the Environmental Institute of Australia and New Zealand. Sorry guys, I'm losing my voice. And that's their code of ethics and professional conduct that they have, and that again applies to all of the members of that organisation. You can see that one's quite interesting. There's duties to promote environmental principles, to demonstrate integrity, to represent and promote the profession, and to practice competently. This is the Engineers of Australia Code of Ethics. Again, we have this idea of demonstrating integrity, practicing competently, exercising leadership and promoting sustainability. And this is the Public Sector Ethics Act that also applies. And you can see there's this idea of the principles of ethics, so integrity, impartiality, promoting the public good, commitment to the system of government, and accountability and transparency. And there's a public service code of conduct that applies that reflects those principles that we talked about. This again talks about this idea that conflicts of interest need to be managed, and that these things need to be disclosed. And also they have to make appropriate use of the official resources and facilities that they're given access to, which is a very big thing with government, making sure that you don't start taking government money and going off on a fabulous holiday overseas, and don't take government cars and decide to go on a long distance road trip with the government car and things like that. So yeah, you have to appropriately use the resources that you're given, ensure appropriate use and disclosure of official information. And I think this is very true. There's no easy answer to what should you do as a public servant, or in fact in any other company, if you see bad decisions being made. I think you should always say something. It's just a question of how far you go. You should always state your opinion and let people know whether you agree or not and your reasons for not agreeing. But it's what happens when people don't respond to that. How far do you go? Do you go to your supervisor, and then do you go to their supervisor? There's a certain level at which you'll start feeling the backlash. Yeah.
Sorry, what if there are duties that are kind of in conflict with each other? For instance, you're saying that people at your law firm were being told on before we started.
Me? I was told that. Yes.
Obviously, you also have a duty of confidentiality, so you can't.
Well, no, I don't have a duty of confidentiality because it wasn't to do with my client's business. Yeah.
So
And I haven't told you his name.
but if, maybe that was a bad example.
Yeah.
There are
But let's...
provisions that, if there are two duties that are in breach of each other,
Yeah.
conflict with each other.
And that's the issue, isn't it? Because it depends how much your moral compass tells you that you want integrity to come before your duty to your company. Which I think probably you've learnt by now that people like Chris McGrath and myself, our feeling is that personal integrity comes first, and then what we're being paid to do comes second. But there are consequences for walking that path. It's not, I don't want any of you to walk away and think that that's an easy journey, because it really isn't. And there are days when I wonder why I don't just shut up and take the money and do the easy job that, colleagues of mine have done, and then they've been content with that. But yeah, it won't always be clear cut as to exactly what you're breaching and how far you go. And within some organisations, like government organisations, you will face backlash. Just, Simone Marsh emailing those senior members, emailing directly into the Chief Executive Officer's department was an absolute no-no, because she then put the Chief Executive Officer on notice about the environmental impacts as he was making his decision. It was an absolute no-no. And she knew what she was doing, because he couldn't deny then that his department had received the email telling him about the groundwater issues. So she put him in a very difficult situation, and she knew it, and she knew what would happen just from doing that, let alone talking out. Yeah, you go first, and then... Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, is it a defence if you go to court to say, I
Not really, no. And it's not, because these defences are quite narrow. They're really meant to be this idea, well, I breached my duty to my company because someone was going to be killed, or there was going to be this big incident, or the environment was, something big and substantial. And, when we're talking about this might happen, this might be an issue, it's much harder to prove, oh yeah, that was definitely a risk, that was definitely a risk to the community. And this is, I should say, these whistleblower protections, they are different depending on which state you're in Australia, and they're different really depending on what sort of topic we're talking about as well. Obviously, if it's a defence issue, you can't talk about it at all. It does not matter whether or not it's in the public interest. You will still be prosecuted. And we had that in the US, the WikiLeaks. All these people, they disclosed it because they felt that it was something that the community needed to know, that this was a real risk. And they were prosecuted for it. Absolutely taken for it. So there was no idea of, well, you were acting in the best interest of the public at the time. It was like, well, no, you breached defence rules, and therefore you will face the full force of the law. Yeah. All right. So we're getting close to wrapping up. So let me... We had these couple of ethical dilemmas, but I think we've had so much discussion around everything else as we're going that we probably don't need to spend too long on them. We're going to cover some of these in the 2014 past paper that we're going to do in the pracs next week anyway. But things like this one. So the ethical dilemma is that your client's proposed a development. You believe it should not be supported without heavy modifications, which is going to make it far less profitable. The client will be extremely displeased if you do not support the proposal, and your firm may lose a lot of lucrative work in the future. What do you do? And this isn't about a right or wrong answer. It's about you asking yourselves now, not oh yeah, what should this person do? But what would I do if I were in that situation? And I what I do know, having worked in private practice, is it's actually really hard, because you sit there and you go, oh yeah, this guy actually seems quite nice, and oh, he's really enthusiastic about this project, and oh yeah, I can see if this project goes ahead, there's going to be some community benefits, there's going to be some, green space, and well, this area isn't being developed anyway, so this will be an improvement. On the other hand, there is going to be a huge amount of impact on this, this, and this, and in an ideal world, it would be a more low-profile development, and you sort of find yourself having to do this pros and cons and going, is it worth my career speaking out about this particular thing? And then most of the time you go, no, it's all, it's good. We might quietly talk to the client and just say to them, if you thought about making this modification and it would make it more attractive to the council if you offered this, and you try and work with the lingo that speaks to them, and you try and compromise, really. And certainly that's what tends to happen until you reach one where you go, no, no, I can't go ahead with that. And then you have to disclose that, because it's a conflict of interest when it's contradicting your own personal beliefs. So you have to then let your employer know and let the client know that actually you don't really agree with this proposal and you don't really feel that you're the best person to work on it. This one is when you're asked to do consultancy work and they give you a budget, and your budget says, okay, they say, okay, you've got $5,000 and that's all you've got, but I want you to write a report that says these are going to be all of the likely impacts on the site. And that's, again, very common, very common. You go away, you calculate it, and you realise that they haven't given you enough funds for you to properly look at the impacts. And so, really, in that case, you need to come back and you need to make it clear to the client exactly what you're going to tell them for $5,000. So it all then becomes part of the contract between you and your client, so that the brief of work, I will look at these matters, and I will not look at X, Y, Z. And the report that you give the client, you've got your limitations in there. We have, this study has been a preliminary desktop study. We have not looked at, habitat of this. There's been no on-site visits, and you make sure that you cover your back in terms of making it clear that you haven't had $20,000, $30,000 to go out and do a full assessment of the site. Because, clients don't want to spend any more than they have to, and what they really want from you is a report that says, yes, they can go ahead. And so, again, it's a bit of a negotiation with them. This one is state government. Manager instructs you to modify your recommendations so that the project can be approved. I'll leave you guys to think about what you would do with a case like that. We've pretty much talked about it today in terms of what we do in those. And then the fourth one is you're working for the local government. The mayor and the councillors strongly support a proposed development. You advise the mayor and councillor of your views, which is that you think it should be refused or heavily modified. They instruct you to prepare an advice to council recommending it. What should you do? So it's the same sort of thing. You have to carry out your obligations under the legislation, and you need to make it clear how you're going to comply with the law. Okay, so for something like that, they're actually asking you to engage in corruption. So it's okay to turn around and say, well, no, I'm going to decide this decision based on the facts in front of me, and this is the decision that I'm going to reach. What did they say in here? This was an email from a past student. So it might be worth adding in a small section about what you would do if you're put in an ethically difficult position by a superior. Say if you were asked by a superior to write a report in a favourable light for a client, which you know isn't right. I'm not sure about your master's students, but for undergrads and from my personal experience, the first time you face an ethically questionable situation is going to be one your boss puts you in rather than clients. And that is so true. That is so, so true. That was certainly the case for me. The first time that I was asked to breach my own obligations as a lawyer was by the partner of my law firm. They have this thing in law, it's called a Chinese wall. So if you are acting on a matter for a client, you are not allowed to have someone else acting for the other side of the matter. So if you're acting for a client who's the developer, you shouldn't also be acting for the council who's approving the development, okay? So you shouldn't be advising both at the same time. If you do, you have to have this thing called a Chinese wall within the law firm that shows that there'll be absolutely no contact between the two lawyers who are acting on the matter, that they'll have no way of seeing the documents that might be being sent back and forth to your clients, and that there would be no possible way that one side would come to know what was happening for the other side. And I was told that I was going to act for one side of the matter, and that the guy sitting in the office next to me was acting for the other side. We shared the same printer. And I said to the partner, because I was sitting my ethics exam at the time to be admitted as a lawyer, and I said to him, we're not allowed to do that. What about the Chinese wall? And he just scoffed at me and said, oh, we don't need to worry about things like that. That's just in your textbooks. And I put up enough of a stink in a public place where other partners could hear me pointing out that this wasn't such a good idea, that in the end they moved. They basically gave the other side to someone else on a different floor of the building and in a different department. So it wasn't just us sitting side by side, sharing the same secretary and sharing the same printer. It was just ludicrous. But it is very true. It will often be someone that says to you, oh, you don't need to worry about that, that we're the one that's asking you to do the wrong thing. So ask yourself, what do you want to achieve in your career? Is it money? Is it helping the community? Is it personal pride? You've all gathered by now that I'm not in it for the money. And I do want to make a difference, and that's why I'm here. And, you know, the money will just have to sort itself out. Ethics doesn't have to be a negative risk to your career. It can be positive if you remind yourself that what you're doing is you're acting with integrity and you're acting in the best interests of the community, and I think that's very true. Things to take home. Be honest. Strive to find the right answer to professional problems and to communicate your views accurately and fairly. Be a good team member. Be friends with your work colleagues. Respect others and value their contribution, and serve the public interest in the community. Your career should be about more than just making money, and you should make public service a core part of it. I think that's very true. So don't be a hired gun. Don't accept instructions from a client to amend reports and so on. Ensure your conclusions are always supported by sufficient evidence and data, and that you properly acknowledge any uncertainty in your reports. There's some examples from the 2012 past papers, which you should be able to answer now that you've got the handouts. Next week in the practice, we'll do the 2014 past paper, and we'll have the Q&A session at the end of the week. Don't forget that you've got your surveys there to fill in. I've only been appointed to do this course for this semester, and at the moment the school is saying they won't keep me on. You can change that if you want to, and that is by filling in the surveys and saying what you think of me as a lecturer. Let me know what you liked, let me know what can be improved, and you know, see if that makes a difference. I've really enjoyed teaching this course, so I would love to come back and do it again. Alrighty, thanks for hanging around. See ya.